Welcome, everyone. I am truly honored to be moderating today's webinar on navigating de-escalation and airspace reopening. This is a topic very close to my heart because when I was the Director General of the Armenian Civil Aviation Authority, the 44-day war between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan broke out. And we found ourselves in a situation where we had to put politics aside and we had to focus on managing overflight risk in real time. And this obviously required very close coordination with our counterparts in Azerbaijan. The Integrated EU Aviation Risk Assessment Group concluded that both authorities were actively managing regional risk to civil aviation. And while this was very encouraging for me to hear as a DG, it also led me to reflect a bit more critically on the situation. How do we actually assess whether we're doing a good job? I come with an aviation tech background, and I did notice a lot of gaps. And I did notice that these gaps could be solved quite effectively and addressed with technology. The core of today's discussion is this: the crisis didn't end when the war stopped. That's when a different kind of challenge actually began. We basically witnessed how complex it was to restore operations and rebuild trust. It takes a lot of time and the aftermath of a conflict. In 2024, global air travel has reached record highs, yet our skies are more fragmented than ever. Airspace is increasingly restricted, not just due to traffic, but also due to active conflicts and sanctions. Tragically, when civilian aircraft are caught in the middle, the consequences are devastating, as we've seen recently with the crash of Azerbaijan Airlines. While shoot-downs do remain rare, the costly consequences of delays, diversions, and cancellations are daily challenges that our industry is dealing with day to day. This is also why this discussion is so important today. We cannot ignore the elephant in the room. These disruptions come at a high cost to our industry, and they place enormous pressure on decision makers. Today's panel brings together a range of perspectives on the challenges of reopening airspace and ensuring business continuity in the aftermath of conflict. And I'm truly looking forward to this conversation because these are not challenges we can afford to postpone, and the solutions do demand urgent attention. And before we dive into the discussion, the agenda briefly is that we will have a panel discussion. It will take around 65 to 70 minutes. And then we will have a Q&A session as well, 10 to 15 minutes. So please do prepare some great questions for us. This is a great opportunity for all of us to discuss this topic. I'd kindly like to invite each of our distinguished panelists to briefly introduce themselves. And maybe we could start with you, Megan.
Sure. Hi, I'm Megan Walker. I'm the head of aviation at Liberty Specialty Markets, or LSM. LSM is a subsidiary of the Liberty Mutual Insurance Group, and we're headquartered in Boston, which is the sixth largest P&C insurer in the world. Aviation is classified as a specialist insurance, and my team and I underwrite a global portfolio of hull, liability, and war insurance from our office in London through our company and Lloyd's platforms. And I look forward to discussing this topic today with you all.
Thank you, Megan. And Guy?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Guy. I'm the head of aviation security, cyber, and crisis management at TUI Airline. We're a group of 5 AOCs operating out of Europe and the UK, operating globally and to multiple destinations across the world. Everything within my remit is essentially wheels up to wheels down, and understanding how secure airspace is the core part of my role within the airline. So really looking forward to the discussion today. And as Tefta said, then please make sure you have some good questions.
Thank you, Guy. Matthew?
Thanks, Tadevik, for moderating today's panel discussion, and very much appreciate Guy and Megan for both joining and bringing their expertise to the table. I'm Matthew Borey. I'm the Chief Intelligence Officer and one of the co-founders of Osprey Flight Solutions. Prior to being at Osprey, I spent several years at the the Med-Air and Control Risk Aviation Security Center, supporting airlines and business aviation operators navigate complex global environments. And prior to entering the private sector, I was in the U.S. Air Force as an intelligence analyst, focused on air and air defense activity globally with multiple deployments to conflict zones and to locations in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. I'm looking very much forward to today's discussion. I think we have a great panel of experts that will be able to give different viewpoints on how resuming flight operations, ensuring business continuity, and keeping flights safe and secure can be done in a complex global aviation operating environment at present.
Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you to all the panelists. Let's jump into this interesting discussion. Dear panelists, we are in a situation where we globally lack a harmonized process that clearly defines what indicators we should actually be monitoring for de-escalation. What are the leading indicators that you rely on to assess whether a situation is beginning to de-escalate? How do you detect or validate that the situation is indeed changing? And let's start with Guy.
Thank you. And you're absolutely right that the absence of a global harmonized framework for de-escalation often leaves quite a significant gap for states and particularly operators to interpret, well, what does de-escalation actually mean? And I think often we're left triangulating quite fragmented intelligence and trying to position that against political narratives and the operational reality. And obviously one of the most immediate indicators for us as an operator is a sustained reduction in hostile activity. So whether it's air missile launches, air defense radar lock-ons, or public threats to aviation or national interests. But of course, it can include the withdrawal of those offensive military assets from particular regions, and I think particularly those which are capable of targeting high altitude civilian aircraft. But we also look to monitor a reduction in hostile rhetoric from state actors. It's not just about the material movement of military units. It's about the resumption of political dialogue. And I think that always acts as a useful indicator that there is an active level of de-escalation.
Thank you so much, Guy. Matthew, do you have anything to add to this as well?
I think Guy's highlighted several different indicators that you can monitor in general for areas of heightened military activity or conflict zones for de-escalation. One of the things that we've learned through our experience at Osprey is relying on historical data to help inform when de-escalation is likely to take place, and then what indicators to monitor for. You mentioned Armenia, Azerbaijan, Tadevik, in your experience in 2020. There was a more recent set of conflict that occurred in 2023, but also prior to that, in 2016, there was conflict as well. What Osprey has built is a database of incidents across conventional military activity and conflict zone dynamics over the past 8 years. What we're able to do is look at what did escalation look like in 2016, in 2020, in 2023 in Armenia and Azerbaijan. What indicators did we see then that caused us to raise risk ratings in the past? How reliable were they? What can we change going forward to be better positioned to understand escalation? But more importantly, what were the key triggers last time of this conflict environment that allowed us to de-escalate risk ratings by monitoring objective data points for change? We were talking as panelists before the call about the current situation between India and Pakistan. Osprey is not relying on solely what's happened in the last 7 days, which is very important to understand. We're looking at escalation from 2019. We're looking at escalation from 2016. What type of activity occurred that led to an escalation? What type of activity led to a de-escalation? And how long was the impact present, both from a overflight risk perspective kinetically, i.e. shoot down potential, diversion, delay, et cetera, from acute conflict zone activity, but what other political or geopolitical issues led to overflight being avoided over those areas for long periods of time? Because as Tadevik already pointed out, airlines not overflying Azerbaijan after the conflict in 2020 had ended in a ceasefire was not based on a risk being present or not present. It was based mainly on interpretations of a geopolitical situation and a potential for escalation or de-escalation that wasn't objective. It was made on subjective approaches. And so what we're trying to do at Osprey is identify objective data points based on our past experience and monitoring conflict zone situations, so that as these situations come back up, which many of them repeat themselves several years over time, we can use that as a template to help us make better decisions. Am I saying that it's a full cookie cutter approach and we go A, B, C, and D, this worked last time, so it must work this time? No, but there's a framework there that allows us to be more intuitive in making recommendations to our clients about when escalation is occurring, but more importantly, when is de-escalation occurring.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. Guy, you mentioned that they look for rhetorical changes or material movements. Can you just briefly give some specific examples of what the indicators could actually be? I understand it can be detected historically, but what are the specific indicators that that you're looking for sometimes?
So I think when we're actively looking for the type of indicators that we would look for, I mean, using historical examples, for example, when we were looking at whether we could resume operations across Iran, we were looking for the active movement of anti-air units away from areas of traditional launch. We were also looking at, for example, when we were looking at whether we could safely resume operations across Israel following the recent conflict, that we were looking at the number of missile launches that were active. So that's something which is actively quantifiable. And I do think often it's as Matthew said, looking historically at the types of de-escalation activity which have happened previously, I think is a really unique way of assessing de-escalation, rather than just looking at it as a sort of a snapshot in time. It's basing that information on what's happened previously and using that to inform your decisions as they move forward.
Great, thank you. Megan, can you actually provide a specific example? Have you been in a situation where you simply did not want to insure a flight, and how did that situation look? And can you just describe the development as well? What needed to happen for that concrete flight to be insurable again?
Sure. I guess when I think about flight requests or requests to go to a hotspot area, I kind of think of the risk or threat level surrounding that flight in question, not really insurable and uninsurable, because it's rarely a binary situation when we're proposed with these things. There obviously has to be an element of fortuity, so there has to be an element of chance. Things need to be not certain. So the greater that situational threat, the less fortuitous a potential loss becomes. And that's how we kind of assess our risk appetite and our price according with the information provided. An example that, kind of an older example, we mentioned Kabul earlier. So when the evacuation of Kabul was taking place, when the takeover of the Taliban happened, we were receiving requests from our insureds to provide evacuation flights. And in the early hours and days of that particular point in time, it was really unclear who was controlling the airport, who was controlling airspace, and it was moving really quickly. And that pressure for humanitarian evacuation was on. So what we do in those situations is we just aggregate as much information as we can. And I guess just like Matt and Guy, we look back at previous situations and we look at the objective situation of the facts that were being provided from our various intelligence sources. We want from our operators as much information as they're able to provide so that we have some idea of the safety and security of the assets on the ground, and things like whether refueling services will be provided or if they're necessary, how long the aircraft will be on the ground, when the flight will take place, is it daylight or is it near dusk, anything they can provide. And we understand those circumstances. Things are moving really quickly and they're not always perfect, but everything and anything that we can understand as a data point with which to make our decision is what we use at that point in time. It's not perfect. I think we live in an imperfect world, and then sometimes that might be reflective in the price or in the aggregate deployed or some of the terms and conditions. That's a moment in time. If there's more information that might improve that, please provide it and we can reassess. So I think as insurers, we try to just do the very best we can with the information that we can in order to enable our clients to do what they do, and for humanitarian aid to be brought places and people to be evacuated as necessary. So it's challenging. We understand it's challenging. We also understand we're kind of the last people sometimes that are contacted because there's a lot going on for the operators in real time, for your people on the ground. So we get that too, and we do the best with what you provide us to make a decision.
So just briefly, your main source of information would be from the airlines, basically, that are present on site.
That's the cornerstone. That's the key. That's where it starts. Particularly as we need to provide a rate based on kind of the aircraft in question, we need to know the value. We need to know it, have an awareness of the limit of liability that you're purchasing, so we can assess our risk. So it starts there, and then we color that and educate ourselves with what we have separately as companies. But often operators have a really great insight, particularly if you have detail on the ground or other security information that we're not privy to. We appreciate that being shared because it helps us make a better, more informed decision.
Thank you. Matt, over to you. I know you had personal experience where your own judgment differed from what the data was actually indicating. Could you describe that situation and explain how you navigated and managed it, the discrepancy in your decision-making process?
So that's a really great question, and I think this is an interesting one because it does deal with escalation, not so much de-escalation, but it can still be helpful. The context of utilizing data-led approaches rather than relying solely on subjective expertise and experience, which is vital in this area. You need to have the expertise to be able to do these types of risk assessments to understand de-escalation. However, you do need to have the right data to put through that, and without it, you can be left relying solely on your gut, which I'm not saying making decisions based off strong experience is wrong. What I'm saying, I think I feel much more comfortable when I have data that can help lead me to an accurate decision. And so in the lead up to the Russia-Ukraine conflict in 2022, in late 2021, the October-November timeframe, we were seeing a buildup of Russian military forces on the border with Ukraine. However, this wasn't necessarily new. In April of that year, forces had built up on the Russian border. Osprey did a case study, I believe it's still available on our website, in April of 2021 saying, look, there's a Russian military buildup. We know people are saying this might be an invasion. Osprey's view it as it's not. They haven't deployed the requisite forces. We aren't seeing the type of electronic warfare activity, which can be detected in GPS interference, for example. We're not seeing the level of military aircraft movements that would be needed to support military operations. Again, military aircraft movements can be detected on ADS-B, for example. So this is not like us guessing. You can look for GPS interference and you can track military aircraft movements with open sources. So in April of 2021, our view was this is not a military invasion. This is an exercise. Now, they may be laying the groundwork to do something like that in the future, and we acknowledge that. In October, November, December of 2021, we start seeing the same military buildup. My initial gut reaction is this is another military exercise. They're not in a dedicated position right now from a force perspective to be able to manage a large invasion of Ukraine. And so in October, even though we started detecting anomalies in GPS interference, we didn't make any risk rating changes. However, by November, even though my gut feeling is still this is more likely an exercise than a military operation, we started seeing the military aircraft movement via ADS-B data spike. We're seeing the GPS interference, which means someone's using electronic warfare to probably try to obscure other people from seeing what they're doing, right? A denial tactic. And so the increase in military aircraft movements and the increase in GPS interference, objective data sources that are publicly available, it can be used if you track and monitor them, allowed Osprey to start to anticipate that a military operation was in fact more likely than an exercise. We raised our risk rating to moderate for the Russian border area and all of Ukrainian airspace. We already had elevated levels for Crimea and the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, but we raised it to moderate in late 2021. In early 2022, as we continued to see more of the same activity and then other deployments of long-range anti-aircraft weapon systems, as well as the forward deployment of helicopter units to the border areas, which is something we didn't see in the April activity, we again raised our risk rating to high and forecasted that an invasion by Russia was likely by the end of the first quarter. And then 3 hours before the Russian invasion started in Ukraine, before Ukraine closed its airspace, Osprey raised its risk rating to extreme and said the Russian invasion is imminent within the next 48 hours. What happened next is Ukraine closes its airspace, Russian strikes start, and we've been in a protracted conflict now for over 3 years. The bottom line is, if I didn't have access to the GPS interference data, the military aircraft movement data, I'm probably relying on my subjective expertise. And we may have been communicating to clients for months that based on my past experience and looking at the news articles I'm reading, I don't think there's going to be a war. That's effectively what we would have said. Based on the data we had access to, the experience the team had, and the trust we have in our process, even if the overall judgment is that it's still possible a military exercise could take place, we rely on objective data sources to help lead us to the most likely conclusion. We still take into account some level of uncertainty into that, and we're willing to adjust our assessments as new data is presented, just like Megan talked about in her pricing, and willingness to ensure flights. New data can help us make a reassessment. At the end of the day, trying to inject objective data points into your decision-making process that you can monitor and review over time will allow you to have more confidence in the decisions you're making, and it'll be easier to articulate change to clients. Because when we raised our risk ratings in late 2021 and early 2022, we weren't saying we think there's going to be a war because we read some news articles. We said there's been an increase in GPS interference that we've tracked. There's been an increase in military aircraft movements that we've tracked. And contextually, as Guy pointed out, there have been deployments of certain weapon systems to certain areas that we had not seen before. And so we're giving objective reasons why we see escalation taking place. The same would be true for de-escalation. Are we seeing a decrease in military aircraft movements? Are we seeing a decrease in GPS interference? Are we seeing the removal of weapon systems from tense regions of military activity? And so, again, subjective expertise is great, and Osprey has a very talented team of analysts. We trust and rely upon the data to help guide our decision-making process.
Thank you so much, Matt. And actually, this is a huge transformation that we're experiencing in the aviation industry, because I think on safety-related issues, we have a lot of data. We know when an engine starts failing, but for some reason, we haven't really been that good at using data when we're talking about conflict zones. So hopefully, this session and future sessions can also help adopt more data and technology to address these gaps. I know it's a very unfair question, and it goes to you, Guy. Do you ever reach a point where you feel fully confident in the decisions to remove previously implemented restrictions?
No, I don't think you can ever reach a point of absolute confidence, not least in the way that I think implies absolute certainty. And in actual fact, I think I'd actually be very cautious of any situation where someone claims to have full confidence in removing restrictions, because I think that quite quickly shifts into having quite a complacent attitude. Certainty in the context of geopolitics and the world that we're currently living in isn't, I think, just unrealistic. I think it's quite dangerous. We're operating, I think, in a very difficult geopolitical environment at the moment where threat dynamics evolve a lot faster, I think, than the traditional risk models can keep pace with them. And I think de-escalation, just as much as escalation, is very rarely linear now. And I think political narratives don't always align with the operational reality that operators are actually seeing. And I think what appears quite stable one day or even 1 hour can become quite unraveled the next. And so we're quite rarely dealing with a fixed endpoint of, well, we have confidence or we don't. But I don't think that necessarily means that you have to freeze as an operator and just stop doing what you're doing because you're not completely confident. You have to embrace, and this is certainly something that we've done in the past couple of years, you embrace that operational uncertainty. I call it informed uncertainty, by using as much structured multi-source intelligence and collaborative judgment that you possibly can to make judgments that are ultimately proportionate, reviewable, but also justifiable to the business. And at the same time, you're looking to calibrate controls and stay as agile as you possibly can. And that's the only way that carriers at the moment are able to survive in the operational environment. But I also would stress that risk assessment isn't just a one-time thing. It's a continuous cycle. It's about reviewing, reassessing, and remaining open to change as we get new information in. So I think rather than chasing this potentially kind of abstract notion of certainty, I'd much rather aim for, I think, informed assurance, which is rigorous enough to act on, but also is, I think the word probably is humble enough to change when you potentially have new information that comes across your table.
Thank you so much for your honesty. I think this is a very, very important message to send. It's not an easy job that you have, and your colleagues as well. That's for sure. So we discussed in the beginning, or I mentioned this in the introduction, that we are in a situation where we're increasingly restricted in terms of space due to traffic, but also active conflict, sanctions, weapon systems are becoming even more better, improved, and so forth. So in that sense, I think it's really important to assess some of the pressures it might bring, because if you have less space, more pressure might occur from a commercial or political sense. Megan, can you please share your perspective? Have you experienced any of these pressures? Can you describe the situation if you have?
I think whether in a conflict situation or just in a normal business situation, all businesses are under pressure, whatever side of the table you're on. Particularly in times of conflict, landscapes change really quickly, which Guy touched upon. And I really like the concept of informed assurance, because I think as insurers, when we're making the decisions and partnering with our airlines about how to provide the cover for risk, we recognize that. We recognize that there are disconnects with political narratives. There are operational realities that are different. And really all we want to know is you have a matrix that you use and a level, your methodology. So we understand the comfort in the way that you make your decisions, so that we can rely on you all to pivot as necessary as the situation moves. And I think coming back to pressure, whether it's resuming regular scheduled passenger services, when you're reopening airspace, or providing that humanitarian aid, it's time, and it's making the best decision based on the information provided. And we understand sometimes that pressure is even greater for operators whose maybe normal areas of operations are almost entirely affected by that conflict. So we take that into consideration, but we also then need to make the best decision possible for the protection of our capital and the deployment of our capital. So it might seem like I think there probably is a pressure point where maybe operators want faster or better or cheaper. But there's we have a business we're trying to manage as well, and we have to be fair and reasonable with that. So we might need more information or a bit more comfort. But I think at the end of the day, whatever the circumstance of the request, we understand we live in a fast-paced commercial world, and that we need to provide a quick service and quick advice. And we hope that we do that to the best of our ability, and just have to trust that the informed assurance that we have mutually is the best one. And with more information, maybe we can make a more refined decision in a week's time, if whatever the decision we made the week before was one that is too expensive or too restrictive. Like, come back. It's a dialogue. And I think over the last few years, it's been very chaotic for the world geopolitically, and there's been a lot of dynamism and a lot more conversations between insurers and our operators, and with entities like yourselves, collaborating together, having conversations in real time instead of maybe reacting to circumstances, conversing about what's happening so that we can kind of problem solve that together. And I've enjoyed that, because I think that's where we need to be as partners. We're all partners in this with respective rights and interests, and how do we work together so that the need at the end, the human need at the end, the business need at the end is solved. So pressure is always there, no matter what, but we manage it.
Yeah, you mentioned that the pressure is there always, but because of the changes, I understand that there's more of a need of having a faster pace in terms of decision making, more dynamic decision making, and decision making that's closer to real time. Guy, I'm curious to hear your perspective on this issue as well. What are the pressures that you experience? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, so there's absolutely there is commercial pressure, but I don't think it's in that simplistic sense of pushing to ignore the geopolitical reality. I think you have to consider it to be more nuanced than that. For any airline, charter, scheduled or otherwise, it's our lifeblood to be able to fly. It's not simply about profitability. It's about connectivity, continuity, and actually it's our fundamental purpose for being. So when we propose an airspace restriction or a route suspension, I think it's entirely appropriate for the business, and it's very healthy for senior leaders to challenge that decision and say, well, why? And I welcome that kind of challenge, and I encourage my leadership to ask, because it forces us as aviation security professionals to think potentially outside of the box, because we're not just thinking about a binary off on closure. Can we have a more nuanced approach? And it does avoid defaulting to caution without due scrutiny of that decision. And it does also help that our risk decisions are then not only proportionate, but operationally and ultimately commercially defensible to our shareholders. So what we try and do is whenever we impose a new restriction, whether it's a route change or risk rating or imposing a no-fly zone, we always accompany that risk assessment with a very clear exit strategy, very clearly defined against measurable KPIs. And that demonstrates the business that we're not only thinking about, well, how are we going to deal with the now, we want to deal with the new normal that we're going to emerge into. And I do think that's really important. There's a lot of people talk about returning to normal operations. Well, actually, in the world in which we currently operate, the normal that you're going back to isn't the normal you exited from. Yeah. So understanding that nuance, I think, is really important. So I mean, from a political point of view, and I know you said commercial and political pressure, I certainly haven't really been at the receiving end of any political pressure, but I think that's partially because when a regulator makes a decision, they're not actually then incurring the cost of that decision. So I don't think the pressure necessarily is on carriers to comply with a NOTAM. It's very much on the other side of a commercial entity to say, well, why are you complying with it?
And this might also change depending on what type of airline you are. If you are a national airline and your government is invested in you, there may be some more political pressures. I think it's a really interesting perspective that you shared, that it's actually good to be challenged as well. And I can very much relate to this, because when the war broke out between Nagorno-Karabakh and Azerbaijan, obviously, as the individual responsible of overflight risk, my human reaction was, let's just close the whole airspace. It doesn't matter where the risk is. I just want the whole thing closed, because then there is absolutely no risk. But obviously, that is not a realistic approach. When you're in a war, you need to be able to bring humanitarian aid to your country. So it's not just about closing the whole thing and having a zero risk approach. So thank you for that. That's really important. Matt, over to you. Do you believe that access to more granular data, such as precise geolocations, timing, and weapon types, combined with forecasting capabilities, can make airline decision-making more dynamic and accurate?
That's a complex question, because the short answer is yes, but you need to have the analytical training to be able to deal with that type of information. You need to understand what type of weapon systems are being used. You need to understand their capabilities. You need to understand the command and control of them. And then also, when we talk about timings and locations, it's not as simple as a point on the map. When I was in Afghanistan, for example, we tracked explosive device attacks on roadways. It was very binary. There was a time of day when it happened. There was a type of weapon that was used, as in the size, the type of explosive, the detonator type, correct. But it was a defined location on the ground. When we're talking about a ballistic missile being launched from one country 2,000 kilometers away from another country, and then being shot down in low Earth orbit, where do you put the dot on the map? Because we all like dots on the map. We love exact locations. So if I could get granular level data for the launch point, the entry into low Earth orbit, the return out of low Earth orbit into the atmosphere, all 5 locations where debris was found, the times when all these things happened, the red alert notifications that went out by a country at the time a NOTAM was issued. I would love to have all that. Unfortunately, that data doesn't typically exist all publicly available, right? And so how do we deal with the complexity that's involved with really a 3-dimensional, 4-dimensional environment? We're not dealing with binary point A, point B, exposure in this radius and a time of day that it occurred, right? So in some ways, yes, it will if it's interpreted in the right way. Does that make sense? You need to understand that just because you have a location and a time, it needs to be taken into the context of that data point. And just because you have a weapon system in a location, the direction that it's pointed, the range that it's capable to, the altitude that it's capable to, and the types of threats that it's defending against will all be involved in the understanding of how that system can function. And so it's something that Osprey has in-house expertise in. The key is being able to utilize that expertise, understand the threat weapon systems, understand where incidents are happening from a locational perspective, a time of day perspective, and an altitude perspective, but then being able to articulate that to an audience that may not have the full understanding, but that they can still use it to make a decision based off the intelligence that you're providing. So I believe, yes, we can make better decisions with that. And I hope that Osprey's approach, using those kind of data points and the expertise we have and articulating that to our clients, is helping them make better decisions. But it's not a simple yes or no. You could provide all this data to anyone, but if you don't necessarily have the expertise to interpret it and put it in the right context and really model it, making decisions based off it without the more nuanced experience is a challenge. And that's what Osprey's trying to help the industry overcome. The gap of the experience needed to conduct these types of complex risk assessments, and then the need to make operational decisions based on them. Because as Guy pointed out, airspace security is vital at this point to overflight. Airline, I mean, I don't want to make this, too doom and gloom, but aircraft aren't being taken down by explosive devices that are being put in cargo holds right now. And in the last 11 years, the 3 largest incidents that have occurred are because of shoot downs. Aircraft aren't being diverted because there's explosive devices potentially in cargo holds. I'm using that as an example because in the 2001 to 2010 timeframe, those kind of things happened. Aircraft were diverted over terrorism threats. Aircraft were potentially targeted by explosive devices that were on board aircraft, for example. It was a real concern that the industry had to deal with. But the threat environment has changed. We are not dealing with non-state actors and terrorist actors using the same types of tactics and techniques and weapons. In some cases, we're dealing with non-state actors, but the weapons that they're using are conventional military weapons. Or the conflict that we're observing, Russia-Ukraine, Armenia-Azerbaijan, Israel-Iran, India-Pakistan. These are state versus state conflicts. The type of systems that are being used are very complex. They are being used at different altitude levels. Stopping something from getting on board an aircraft is irrelevant to this discussion. And that expertise in being able to assess the new type of risk that is facing overflight requires training, experience, and backgrounds that I don't necessarily think the industry is caught up to in the people that we have in positions that are making some of the decisions. And so we need to bridge that gap. I think there's been some really great actions done by ICAO in raising risk awareness as part of the Global Aviation Security Plan, the GASSP. I think IATA's airspace risk course is helping raise risk awareness. I think that the World Overflight Risk Conference that Osprey and EASA held, and even the more recent Safer Skies Forum, are bringing more attention to this. But now we need to shift from just raising, hey, this is an issue, to practical application of how we deal with it. Because we dealt with it as an industry during that 2001 to 2010 timeframe, and the results speak for themselves since. We're not seeing those type of issues at any near the rate that we were prior to that. But now we have a different type of challenge that we're facing, and we need to adjust the frameworks that we're using and the expertise that we're bringing to the table to solve the challenge.
Mhm. And from a practical application, I guess with all these restrictions, maybe we do need to be a bit more flexible in the way we think. I mean, if there's activities going on that are dangerous in the middle of the night, maybe we could conduct flights during the day. So over to you, Guy. Having access to more granular data like this is one thing, but feeling comfortable enough to actually make decisions based on open source intelligence is something else. Would you feel confident enough to make decisions based on open source alone? If you could let us know.
So I'm going to answer this question in a slightly roundabout way. No, I don't think I'd ever feel confident relying on a single data source alone, whether it's open source or restricted. And I think that's something which I learned very much in my time in the British Army, is that you don't just rely on one piece of data to make a decision before you pull the trigger. It's a fundamental principle of intelligence-led risk management for me. It's not about whether a source is classified or public. It's about whether there is sufficient convergence of evidence across those multiple streams, and critically, the credibility of those sources and the ability to validate that assumption against those sources and your own assumptions. I think national government advice, particularly from our own state authorities, is often, I think, the baseline, certainly in TUI, that we base our risk assessment on. It does give us a really clear frame of reference, and particularly when those authorities are aware they have access to strategic or classified information. But that advice often, unless it's a complete prohibition, of course, is just advice. The problem is it's not terribly dynamic. Restricted information by nature, I think, lags behind the operational reality. And I think that's where open source intelligence, and particularly from Osprey, has become so powerful in the past couple of years, because it offers that real-time insight, very diverse perspectives that are often not politically motivated and are very often the very early indicators of change. But I do think with any kind of intelligence, open source or otherwise, the old adage of trust but verify is something that we are quite wedded to. And even when we receive advice from government sources, we don't take it at face value. We don't take open source information at face value. We have to test it against what we're seeing elsewhere. So I don't think it's a binary choice about choosing between an open or restricted source. It's creating that mosaic, I guess, of intelligence, and then stepping back and seeing all of it, rather than just focusing on one or two bits that are quite attractive.
Thank you so much for your perspective on this. And you did mention that regulators might not be as dynamic as we would wish them to be. Based on that, Megan, if we look at all the airspace restrictions, can we afford having regulators that are not dynamic and sometimes even contradicting each other, not agreeing on the different risk levels? Are you, as an insurer and later also the airline, able to knock on the doors of the regulators to tell them you need to update your advisories? This is actually restricting our operations.
I guess it's different being the insurer, because we're not operating, obviously, the aircraft ourselves. So we are, when we're making decisions about underwriting, we're underwriting the operator and the operator's approach to risk, and then applying our own lens of risk over that information. So when it comes to regulators and conflicting information or politically driven information, it's kind of back to the data point question. It's a part of the data points that we take into consideration when we're making a decision. But that probably affects more Guy's decision making and an operator's decision making in terms of go or no go, what can we do, what flight path do we take. So we rely on, I guess, the expert decision made from operators about how to navigate some of the challenges of maybe conflicting information about airspace. And I appreciate in Europe it's challenging because each air navigation service provider is responsible for each bit and stitching all that together across the landmass is challenging. So we appreciate that, but that's something that kind of we're once removed from, and take the view from our operators on how they're navigating that, and then using our more the safety and security, whether the airspace is able to be flown. And some of the more nuanced and detailed conflicting information that might be more of a challenge is more of an operator's challenge than the insurer's challenge per se in the immediate sense.
But if we look at the premiums, would it impact the premium if there is an advisory on a certain airspace that a operator wants to operate over?
It depends. It depends on the level of severity of the advisory. Obviously, if airspace over a country is entirely closed and a request for flight is asked, we need a lot of information to understand how flight can happen, what sort of permit, if a permit's even available to go. And that's a much easier situation. If it's a more nuanced, we recommend you don't fly. I mean, it's a data point and will affect some pricing. There are certain flight areas or countries or airports that almost always have some sort of heightened risk or situation, which incurs a premium that's more elevated than not. So it is taken into consideration, but we also expect the operator to communicate with us what they're doing. Perhaps that's different as well. And if it's more complicated, we rely on the operator to help demystify some of those complications from an operator's perspective, because you're closer to it than we are, because we don't operate aircraft.
Thank you. And over to you, Guy. Are you able to influence the regulators? I mean, if there is an outdated advisory, will you be able to knock on their doors and have an impact?
I don't think we can necessarily influence a huge amount. I mean, we are quite robust in conversations with the DFT and otherwise to say, actually, your restriction isn't necessarily reflective of the operational reality on the ground. I think we quite frequently say to regulators that that they do need to speed up their decision-making process. And particularly in a world where often, I mean, we're a multi-AOC operator that has interfaces with multiple regulators, from the LBA to the CAA to the DFT and otherwise. And often when that is contradictory information, that is one of the areas where we can say, well, hang on a minute, your partners in Europe are saying one thing and you're saying the other. Can you please try and explain why there is a difference? And I think it goes back to my point earlier around a willingness to challenge. As much as I'm very willing for my leadership to challenge me, mature regulators, I think, do have a view that they are quite willing to be challenged by mature carriers. And I think having that dynamic, active, and complementary conversation, I think, does help nudge them in the right direction. So can I stand here and say I've ever been able to convince the DFT to change a NOTAM or the FAA to change a NOTAM? Absolutely not. But what I can do is I can nudge them in the right direction.
Got it. Matt, from your perspective, I know that Osprey does use regulators as a source. How does it impact Osprey when there's contradictions or maybe outdated advice?
So Osprey monitors the restriction, prohibition, or advisories that are issued by leading civil aviation governing bodies in the conflict zone space. So Germany, France, EASA, the US, the UK, and Canada. We make this available to our clients through our core service offering, where they can visualize where any of those countries have an advisory, prohibition, and restriction. And we also have a product called Osprey Sentinel, where you can integrate your actual flight plans into that matrix of data and monitor where you're flying over any regulators, advisories, prohibitions, and restrictions to better understand your exposure. So how that has impacted those restrictions and advisories have impacted Osprey. There's a complex web of these advisories. You would think many of them are the same. If you actually look at them, they are very different. Some areas are covered at all altitudes by a regulator. The same area may not be covered at all. It could be a recommendation. It could be a prohibition. And the altitudes can differ. And so how it's affected Osprey, we've had to develop new products and tools to help our clients understand what their regulatory exposure is, and if they're using those regulatory advisories or prohibitions or restrictions as an intelligence source, as in this is the regulator communicating to me that there is a risk in a certain place at a certain altitude. That's how they're accessing that intelligence. It's not easy to go find that on the internet, to be honest. If you went and searched for, the restrictions from the United Kingdom on conflict zones for airspace, it's buried in an AIP or in the NOTAMs that are issued for the United Kingdom's own airspace. So we've had to find a way at Osprey to bring this all together. So that's one way that it's challenged Osprey, but we hope that we're helping everyone overcome that challenge through those tools. The other way it challenges Osprey is that we get requests from clients to help explain why a regulator has changed advice versus another regulator, which is difficult for us to do because we're not the regulator. We didn't make the change. We didn't put it in place in the first place. But we can help give a nuanced, apolitical third-party view on why a regulator may have made a certain decision at a certain time, why it may be different than other regulators, but more importantly, how this can be used in the risk management process as an inject. It's a positive that when a regulation is changed, an operator is coming and asking the question, how does this affect me? Does this indicate a change? It can be an indicator of escalation or de-escalation, as we're talking about in the webinar here. However, it is a challenge when it's reactive, when it's extended for months and months and months, even after ceasefires, even after disengagement and de-escalation has occurred, for a third-party intelligence provider like Osprey to try to interpret that and articulate it to clients. So we've tried to shift the view to make it more so how do your flights interact with these areas, and which restrictions, advisories, prohibitions do you care about, and personalize it to the operator so that they can use regulatory information within a framework that suits them. There isn't a one size fits all. Guy at TUI is going to have a different approach to this because of the different AOCs he's under than a business aviation operator that's registered in Bermuda and can fly anywhere, anytime, at any altitude without any real restrictions, but still wants to take information from regulators into account in their risk management process. And so being able to be dynamic in the way that we feed information to clients and make it useful to them to suit their operations is the approach we've taken, rather than trying to be the referee in between operators and regulators on, well, the regulator said this, but we think that, and you should do this. That's not where we want to be. The operator has a set of regulatory information that they want to utilize as part of their process, and then we can help make that bespoke to them by A, giving them digital tools to access the information, or B, automate it through tools like our Sentinel product, which will literally allow them to set it and manage their exposure to regulatory information based on their specific set of flights.
Yeah, you actually mentioned that very often advisories are extended despite that the conflict has ended. I think this is very, very relevant to our discussion today in terms of reopening airspace. As a regulator myself, I was super frustrated because of this. Basically, even after the conflict had ended, I would call these leading voices around the world and I would tell them, well, the war is over. Can you please update your advisory? And nobody really wanted to take that responsibility. They'd rather wait for the advisory to automatically delete itself because it had a deadline put into it. But it was really difficult to get people to gather around the table to discuss de-escalation. I mean, they're very fast at gathering around the table when we're talking about escalation, but as soon as it's de-escalation, and particularly if it doesn't impact their own operators that much because there's no pressure, they just don't do it. And as a regulator, this was very frustrating because it doesn't only impact airlines and insurance companies. It actually also impacts the air navigation service provider, because if one of the main revenues that you get is from overflight, and you need to pay salaries to those air traffic controllers, well, then it is actually quite disrupting that there is advice around your airspace, despite that there is no risk any longer. I do also understand the people behind here, because I think the biggest question is, what if it escalates again and we haven't put out a timely advisory? So let's just keep it in just in case. I think that I do understand the challenge, but in this situation where there's all these conflicts going on and airspace being further restricted, I do think that we do need to be more dynamic. And also, regulators don't really bear the cost associated with these advisories. So over to you, Guy, and Megan afterwards. Could you please describe some of the costs that airlines and insurance companies face when flights are not restarted timely due to outdated advisories?
Yeah, sure. I mean, first, there's the obvious direct operational costs. Reroutes around closed and restricted airspace often result in substantial increases in fuel burn, often adding hours to a flight and consuming often tens of thousands of additional kilos of fuel per sector. I don't necessarily just want to talk about that in terms of the financial cost. There's also the environmental cost of burning more fuel than you actually need to. So from a sustainability point of view, it's not very good for the industry. Secondly, there's extended flight times lead to more crew hours, tighter roster margins, increased rest requirements. And this puts further strain on the flight planning and on fatigue management systems as well. And from a mental health point of view, you don't want to be pushing your people too hard. And there's also the wear and tear on aircraft. And we've seen this quite a lot when we've had to fly faster and higher across conflict zones, particularly in areas where it's hot and high. So aircraft operating on longer routing cycles, particularly our wide body 787s, face much greater airframe fatigue and higher maintenance burden. And over time, this accelerates the life cycle cost of the aircraft and reduces our asset utilization quite significantly. I mean, understandably, you are balancing this against, quite rightly, the fundamental need to protect the lives of everyone on board the aircraft. And we only have to remember the Azerbaijan jet crash or PS752. They're very sobering reminders of when you do make potentially the wrong decision, and there's no cost saving is ever worth that misjudged risk. But it does further demonstrate that as an industry, we need to do more to have more dynamic risk management positions. And as Matthew spoke about at the beginning, being able to have that very dynamic approach and nuanced approach that open source intelligence, I think, provides, does allow airline operators such as ourselves to resume operations sooner without compromising safety. And I think they're some of the kind of the incremental costs. And of course, there's also the reputational damage, which you can't put a cost on.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Those were really, really interesting examples. Do you also have examples where you've actually had to divert or delay or cancel your flights because of outdated advisories? Because they typically happen post factum, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's where we've seen, and I think not necessarily the cancellation or the rerouting, but I mean, what I'd quite like to talk about is we do have this disparity between two of our regulators, particularly with Iran. We did with Iran, not so much anymore, where our UK aircraft couldn't operate to Iranian airspace, but our Nordic aircraft could because they were on a different registration. The risk is no different. One is registered in Norway, and one's registered in Sweden, and one's registered in the UK. But we were in a position where we were burning, we were rerouting via Saudi, which is nearly 2 hours south of Iran, on one type of aircraft versus the other. So there are tangible examples of where we have had to make difficult business decisions because we can't reconcile the often conflicting information which comes out of a regulator. And there are plenty of examples where we've had to stop aircraft going into a piece of airspace because we were unsure. Well, actually, if we had a better quality of information, then we may have made a different decision.
Mm-hmm. And I guess as well, sometimes airlines can get requests for conducting certain flights, but then uncertainty also leads to saying no to those commercial opportunities. And that's lost revenue that we very often forget about. Megan, over to you. Can you bring a couple of examples?
I guess it's the insurance cost, and the knock-on cost is more of an operational cost. So premiums charged are relative to the risk, so they scale according to frequency of flight and severity of that risk. So if there's a particular higher threat environment or perceived higher threat environment, and we are going off information that it's higher threat, we might be charging more for longer, and maybe that conflicts with the view of the operator. So that's an increased cost. But generally, it's because it's scalable with the risk. It's not the same as the operational frictional cost that the operator bears with diversions and things. But that said, when there's any sort of diversion or change in landscape or difference, whether it's fatigue or different route structures, that can then end up being a safety issue, and there might be more propensity for some sort of loss, which then would impact your claims record and impact insurers in terms of what we might have to pay. So we're not completely immune to it, and obviously the premium that we charge is something that operators have to bear, and we appreciate that sometimes that's in the backdrop of a disrupted fleet schedule and flight schedule. So it kind of goes hand in hand, but in terms of I guess the direct question of the impact on insurance costs, it's really scalable with the threat. So it's a good thing for us if the risk reduces and we feel that we can charge less, because that means our potential risk is less. So sometimes that's not a bad thing for us.
Yeah, got it. And a question to all three of you. Do you believe it's possible to shift our industry from reactive to proactive decision making, and in doing so, reduce the costs that we just discussed? Matt, over to you.
I believe it's necessary that we do it, and there's plenty of reasons why. We've discussed several of them here. But when we think about some of these decisions, whether it's by an operator to avoid flights over a piece of airspace for an extended period of time, based off a government advisory or prohibition or whatnot, or it's based off their own risk assessment that may not be dynamic. Risk changes in airspace around some of these areas as well, right? So if you're leaving restrictions on in place where de-escalations happen, and you're aggregating aircraft over other areas where escalation could also take place or maybe happening as well, and not giving alternate routing options, you're now just aggregating more aircraft in a position where they have less options to then make different operational decisions as the situation changes. Because we're not again, it would all be fine if this were the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 and it's contained to Afghanistan and the threat is below flight level 260, right? But we're dealing with ballistic missiles, military-grade weaponized drones, high-altitude SAM systems in a variety of different countries, right, that are crossing thousands of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers regularly at various different altitudes. And sometimes places like Iraq at present are de-escalating, where we've seen a dramatic drop in ballistic missile use, drone use, cruise missile use, air defense system use at all altitudes. Compared to last October, compared to last year this time, Iraq, the level of activity is nowhere near that. In places like Yemen, however, and the Red Sea, we're seeing a different trajectory after a brief lull during a 6-week ceasefire to a reemergence of that. If you're having to operate through Saudi Arabia, for example, because you can't use Iranian airspace because of your regulator, even though escalation is happening in that part of Saudi airspace due to air defense activity to defend against Houthi rebel activity, you can't shift over to Iranian airspace, hypothetically, because of potentially an outdated regulatory restriction, even though de-escalation has occurred in Iranian airspace based off any objective data that's presently available. And I think the reason why this happens is because we're not using proactive risk management. In fact, we're not even using risk management in certain cases. You're looking solely at the threat. Have Iranian air defenses tangibly changed even after Israeli strikes targeting Iranian air defenses? Iran still has a plethora of air defense systems deployed across the country, i.e. it has the capability to conduct air defense operations. That's the first half of threat. The second half of threat is intent. Iran continues to have an intent to defend its airspace. So the threat is relatively binary. The capability is there. Iran has the systems. The intent is there to defend its airspace. What is different is the likelihood that an event that would lead them to have to utilize the capability and the intent has gone down, as in the first half of risk, likelihood, and impact. If we reduce the likelihood of the risk equation, even if the impact is catastrophic, the risk level has gone down. And so what I think happens is we get in a process where we're looking at the threat, which is binary and static, and we're using that to make risk management decisions, which is supposed to be based off likelihood and impact. And so the intertwining and commingling of threat and risk continues to happen across the industry. They both need to be taken into account. One needs to be taken account on the identification and analysis side, i.e. the threat side of the equation. The other needs to be taken into account in the likelihood and impact side. And if you can stick to using the likelihood and impact, you can identify escalation and de-escalation, because very rarely are you going to see a threat escalation or a threat de-escalation. For a threat escalation, you need new system capabilities. Very rarely is that going to happen, or you need an intent reduction. If you ask operators or governments or insurers, or if you ask me, what's the hardest thing to measure? Intent. It's always the hardest thing to measure. So if there's rarely a change in capability, to be honest, and intent is the hardest thing to manage, then we need to keep threat in a very defined area and focus much more on likelihood changes, because impact is largely static as well. If we're talking about the outcome of a potential shoot down, it's going to be catastrophic. Now, you can do things to reduce the impact on diversions, delays, cancellations, et cetera. That is where you get into mitigation measures to reduce the impact. Risk can be brought down by mitigation measures on likelihood and mitigation measures on the impact. It's very difficult threat mitigation measures in something that's so binary, especially in a world where we're dealing with state-based conflict or non-state actors with state actor weapons capabilities. That threat is going to remain largely static, and it will get misinterpreted as risk, which is why these regulations get put in place for too long, and in certain cases why airlines continue to not fly over places like Armenia or Azerbaijan well after a conflict's over. Did Armenia's weapon systems dramatically change? Like, were they scaled up? Like, was the intent of Azerbaijan, did it change to defend their airspace during that time period after the war? No, the threat remained binary. It was there, it persisted, and it's being misinterpreted as risk. The likelihood dropped dramatically due to a ceasefire that was upheld, and there were mitigation measures that you can put in place on routing aircraft north of Nagorno-Karabakh rather than over Nagorno-Karabakh, routing aircraft closer to the Turkish border and the western half of Armenian airspace rather than down through the Zangor corridor and into Iranian airspace. So using geographical deconfliction could have been used as a mitigation measure. I think the key point here is there's things you can do to manage the risk. There's very little on the threat side that can be done. And if you commingle the two together, you'll get complacency. Well, the threat's still there, so I'm not going to fly. Or the threat's still there, so we're going to keep the regulation in place.
Thank you, Matt. And I think what I got out of this conversation with you is that, for example, Iran, Iranian risk ratings have changed dramatically over the past 6 months.
At Osprey, since 2018, the risk has gone from low to moderate to high to extreme, back down to high, back up to extreme, down to high, down to moderate, stayed at moderate for a very long time, and then escalated back up to extreme. And now we're back down to moderate because the risk has not been stable. What has been stable is the capability and intent of the Iranian air defense forces. Mm-hmm. The capability is there, the intent is there, and this is historical, right? For 20 years, we have data on Iranian air defense forces misidentifying aircraft. The question is, what time periods is that most likely to happen? Not whether or not it will happen. We know the intent's there. We know the capabilities there. The question is, when is it more likely to happen? And what can I do to reduce the impact of my exposure to that? Fly during the day, fly over the northeast portion of the country, for example, and you've got two great mitigation measures. But if you're solely basing this on, is the Iranian air defense network capable and did they have the intent to target aircraft, you're going to be in a very difficult proposition because the answer to both of those things will continuously be yes. That needs to be taken into account. Threat identification and analysis is fine, but then it needs to move on to likelihood and impact, which are going to shift over time, especially if you have effective mitigation measures.
And from a cost perspective, that is a huge impact. I mean, Armenian airspace is limited, but Iranian airspace is quite huge. So avoiding it due to not dynamically monitoring the situation can have a severe economic impact on airlines.
And the alternative to this, for example, is Saudi airspace at present. Many of the regulators have no advisories in place on Saudi airspace.
Mm-hmm.
I think, well, I think anyone who's an Osprey client or anyone in general would understand that there's hazardous activity happening at all altitudes in several areas of Saudi airspace, but there's no government advisory. So the lack of a government advisory doesn't mean there's a lack of threat or risk. There's often political motivations behind that. And so you need to be able to do, yes, your own ability to evaluate threat, but more importantly, dynamic risk assessment that involves data and proactive mitigations.
Thank you, Matt. Over to Guy. So just to remind you the question in terms of going from reactive decision-making to proactive, what the impact could be on cost reductions from your point of view.
So I think same with Matt, really, I do believe it's entirely possible. We've seen, I think, a shift away from, not enough, but there has been a shift away from that reactive position to one of proactive, and it is necessary for the industry to shift to that model, if nothing else, for its own cost base, but also I think ultimately in the long term for its own survival. But I do think we need to be quite realistic that none of us, not even Osprey, have the complete gift of foresight. There will always be moments where we are required to react quickly to the unexpected, black swan events, things coming out of left field. And I think that's because it's the name of the game in aviation. It's always operating in quite a volatile world. But that said, I think moving towards a more proactive posture is absolutely the right direction to do. It's not necessarily about predicting the unpredictable, but it does mean building effective tools, intelligence frameworks, and decision-making structures within the airline community to allow for earlier detection, more flexible planning, more flexible contingency planning as well, with a broader range of response options. And that is something that we really push for, is if we see an event emerging, we don't just have a binary, we're going to do this or that. We have to have a whole spectrum of options which we can choose from we're just going to change a flight route a couple of degrees left or right, but to we're actually going to turn off a flight route entirely. And I do think that is a problem in the industry, is that we too often default to that binary approach because it's a comfort blanket, open or closed, as safe or unsafe. But that's not reflective of the real world, which we all know is far more complicated. So having this proactive shift, I think certainly enables airlines to reduce costs because it preserves operations without compromising safety. We can articulate to our leadership that we are continuing to operate in an area where there is a certain level of geopolitical dynamism, but we're doing so in a way which maintains that safety envelope. But it also means we can be more agile in resuming operations when the situation improves, because we've planned for that in advance. So the long answer to all of this is yes, we do need to be more proactive, because I can't see the world becoming more secure anytime soon.
Any final points, Megan, as well, to this question?
Yeah, I feel like I have more questions for Matt and Guy, but no, where my head went to with this was sometimes it depends on the circumstances. As Guy said, sometimes it's imperfect and you have to just make the decision. So if the capability and intent information is blunt and the likelihood and impact is blunt, we're going to make a quick decision for that one flight. But I think what the difference is, we're not just looking at the geopolitical risks, from an insurance perspective. We'll be looking at the actual physical damage to the aircraft, the people themselves on board, the impact of an aircraft if it crashed, plus the risk of airspace and the impact of an overflight. And if it's one flight, it's one decision. If it's a series of flights or a new route, it's another. And that's where we can drill into that capability intent and really your risk assessment and the information that you have, so we can color that further and then price it more appropriately. So I think sometimes you just have to react because that's just the reality of the situation. It's quick and you must just move on. And other times when it's something that's if it's a new operational situation for a client, they will have made a considerable, amount of input and decisions in order to get to that point, to fly to that place, share that so that we can nuance our pricing and really get a better, more nuanced view of the risk at hand. And sometimes it's just the operating environment is challenging. So it might be safer, but the actual operational environment in terms of infrastructure and oversight is more of a risk, which is that's what's driving the pricing. It might not be the geopolitics at all. So it's multiple frames that we're assessing at the same time, and it's just that communication and information which helps us make that better for you all.
I completely agree that not all situations, obviously, I mean, sometimes you will need to make last minute decisions, but I do think with data available today and forecasting capabilities being possible today, it is possible also to plan for different scenarios and not be as surprised as well, and avoid those costs from diversions, delays, and cancellations. But it's not easy, and it does require that we learn not only to trust our gut, but also to trust what the data is telling us. Thank you so much for this panel debate. We will now move into the Q&A session, and we have a couple of questions ready. And the first question is for Guy. How do you communicate to your workforce about a de-escalation, and what did you do to convince them that your assessment is accurate? I assume you can have some challenges with crew and a lot of other stakeholders inside your airline.
So I think the first thing with trying to convince anyone about anything is actually to, not just in the aviation sphere, is to make sure that you're trusted. And you can only do that through demonstrating that you have a good understanding of your field of expertise. I'm very fortunate that TUI enables me to have a platform where I do get to actively engage with crew, whether they're flight crew or cabin crew or other parts of the business and other stakeholders on a very regular basis. And I do think that's important. That aviation security has historically always been a bit of a siloed entity. It's operated in a dark room at the back of the office, and people don't really know what goes on in there. But actually, I do think it's important that when you are articulating, do need to close a piece of airspace, and the flip side is when you do need to reopen a piece of airspace, that you're as transparent as you possibly can be. And that's actually something that open source material really gives us the edge on, is that we can be completely transparent with it. Whereas with our restricted sources, 95% of the time, we can't tell anyone about what's in the material. But we use a variety of methods to communicate that. On our first port of call is always engaging very early on with our flight operations teams, particularly with our MP flight ops and that senior leadership, to make sure they have the buy-in. But once we've articulated that, we either will communicate directly with flight crew, air crew, other parts of the business through ops notice, so they have it in front of them, demonstrating why we have taken certain decisions. But something that we have found, and I've found, is particularly effective, and we did this on several occasions when we've gone back into locations where, for example, when we were going back into Tunisia after the Sousse attacks back in 2015, or when we resumed operations across Iran, that we make time to conduct webinars, we make time to conduct opportunities to people for ask us questions, because I think that is where the uncertainty lies, is where people have been asked to operate across airspace that is plastered all over the news as potentially unsafe, because people look at social media and they don't necessarily dig into the actual news. But we provide them the answers to that, and it gives them the opportunity to have a two-way conversation. And I think that is critical, is articulating, is facilitating a two-way conversation between the guys and girls in the cockpit versus the people that are making decisions on the ground. And I think that's, if you can get that right, you're 95% of the way there.
Mm-hmm. And have you seen a change recently that crew are challenging you more?
Yeah, and we very much we welcome it. I mean, it's an opportunity for us to learn and reflect and grow. And I think certainly with the emergence of more open source material, which is freely available, some of our more active crew are actually picking up on the information and actually actively challenging about it, which is great. When I turned up in the industry 20 years ago, there wasn't that willingness to challenge security. It was that decision which is made and you have to follow it, and that's it. But actually, having this more holistic approach, it really feeds into the necessity of having that positive security culture. It really works very, very well.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Matt. So you discussed historical indicators. Would you apply the same indicators to every conflict region, or should each region's unique indicators be assessed?
Sorry, could you read the question again?
Looks like I was muted. Sorry. So Matt, this question is for you. You discussed historical indicators. Would you apply the same indicators to every conflict region, or should each region's unique indicators be assessed separately? Also, if any, what are the most common indicators to look at?
That's an excellent question. I think since so much of this does deal with geopolitical instability, Guy talked about aggressive rhetoric by governments, for example, being one of the things that are monitored. That's always going to be different from country to country. Some countries have open press. Some countries don't have a free press. Some countries have open access to social media. Some countries do have access to social media. Sometimes in the lead up to conflicts in certain locations, social media access can be cut. Government communications can be limited. And in certain cases, there can be differing information from one government to another on their view of a situation. And so when it comes to those kind of geopolitically related indicators, you need to build those specifically for the conflict zone that you're looking at. However, there are some things that Osprey utilizes to look at any given conflict zone as an indicator. The presence of GPS jamming and spoofing is now becoming a hallmark of conflict zone activity and conventional military activity. That activity is likely going to emerge in advance of conflicts, and we see it time and time again. Already, India and Pakistan, if you utilize in the Osprey Atlas tool our GPS interference overlay, you'll start to see that we're picking up data on that. If you go to gpsjam.org, which is a publicly available tool, or you go to Sky Data Services, that will show you GPS jamming and GPS spoofing, you'll already see that activity is happening in parts of Indian and Pakistani airspace at increased levels than it was happening prior. And to be honest, it was already happening in previous months and over time. But utilizing that publicly available data on where GPS interference is occurring, new areas where it's occurring, the intensity of it occurring, the presence of jamming versus spoofing, or the emergence of spoofing coming into play, is one of the key things that Osprey is utilizing to help proactively identify potential conflict areas. It's not a single source that means, yep, that conflict's going to erupt because we're seeing this, but it can be an indicator. It can also be an indicator of the type of weapons that are potentially going to be used. You're not going to jam and spoof GPS unless the type of weapon systems you're dealing with, defending against, are guided. So if a country is jamming and spoofing GPS, they're worried about GPS guided weapons, whether those be drones, ballistic missiles, or cruise missiles. So it can be an indicator of not only geographic location of where conflict may happen, but it can also be an indicator of the type of weapon systems that a country is concerned about having to defend against in a conflict, which can show escalation or de-escalation. There's a big difference between artillery shelling on the line of control in India and Pakistan, or the potential for GPS-guided air-launched cruise missiles and ground-launched ballistic missiles. And so the presence of GPS jamming and spoofing can point towards a larger, more sophisticated conventional conflict emerging. The other thing that we track very closely is military aircraft movements. So military aircraft many times fly with their ADS-B transponders on. Osprey collects every military aircraft movement with ADS-B transponders on in every flight information region globally, and we get a daily count of the number of aircraft that moved in that airspace with a military transponder code on. Spikes in military activity can indicate that a conflict's potentially coming. Also, a drop completely of military aircraft movement via ADS-B can indicate it as well. The likelihood that there's no military aircraft movements in Iranian airspace is not a good thing. Does that make sense? If ADSB is showing no military aircraft movements in Iran over a 24 or 48-hour period, it's unlikely that all military aircraft are grounded. What's more likely is that they're flying with their transponders on. Excuse me, their transponders off. So utilizing those types of things can be very helpful. In addition, looking at cargo aircraft flights by third-party contractors to military bases in different countries can be a useful indicator as well. This indicates weapon shipments. We've been looking at this with Israel. We've been looking at this with Iran. We looked at it with Armenia and Azerbaijan. We're monitoring it right now for India and Pakistan. In the lead up to an escalation in a conflict, there's typically going to be some form of weapons pre-supply, rather not necessarily resupply, but pre-supply. It can also be resupply during conflict. So seeing how those levels are continuing. If they drop off significantly, it's likely an indicator that conflict de-escalation is possible because there isn't resupply coming from third-party countries that have been involved in providing shipments. So military aircraft movements, being able to look at those on a daily basis and a monthly basis in aggregate, GPS interference and GPS jamming, as well as those kind of third-party cargo flights to support weapons resupply. You can apply those to almost every state-based conflict universally as some form of indicator of escalation or de-escalation. As we shift over to the geopolitical side, however, you need to do that individually. What type of Pakistani statements or diplomatic moves would indicate escalation? What type of Indian statements or diplomatic moves would indicate de-escalation? That's not going to be uniform from India, Pakistan to Iran and Israel. They'll be completely geopolitically different. You need to identify the right ones based on historical precedents to help, and then utilize some of those more objective universal data sources, like I talked about with the GPS interference and military aircraft movements, as objective ways to monitor escalation and de-escalation. What I will say is Osprey's trying to approach this uniformly, though, in all the situations that we're monitoring, where we're now providing our clients with dedicated indications and warning for every situation area globally that we're looking at, and that those indication and warnings are feeding into the forecasting we're doing on the trajectory of those potential conflicts or active conflicts.
And actually, just to add on to this as well, I mentioned that I noticed some gaps during the war, the 44-day war. And one of the major gaps that I noticed is that our industry relies a lot on manual processes. So basically, having to assess all these sources consistently, day, night, Saturday, Sunday, is impossible to do when you do it manually. So you will miss out on a lot of information, and identifying those indicators as well. I mean, you need technology to do that. A human cannot do that. Assess all historical materials available to see when there is a certain change in a situation. There's one more question. How can we use risk assessment practices to assess suitability for resumption of flights on a route subsequent to the reopening of an airspace over recognized conflict zones? Who wants to take this one? It's not addressed to anyone concrete. Shall we try it with you, Matt?
It's a very interesting question. I think the demands on the industry are going to be more and more complex over time, and this is due to the geopolitical instability that we have in the world. Shifting dynamics in relationships between world powers, disruption to supply chains, and the ever-growing presence of state versus state conflict is an era that is different than what we saw in the first 15 to 20 years of the 21st century. This is a challenge for aviation because as much as any one country can look to shift inwardly and become more populist in nature or even isolationist, aviation isn't functioning that way. It's a global connectivity that brings us all together. The complexity of that, though, does mean collaboration. It does mean embracing new technology, and it also means finding new and agile frameworks that fit the current operating environment and breaking the molds that we may have made for a specific period in time. So what worked in the past was effective to deal with a global war on terror, if you will, time frame. What we're dealing with now in a multipolar world with dynamic changing environments is one where the industry needs to take a similar approach, break down silos, share information, but at the same time, establish frameworks that can be repeatable. We need these frameworks to be utilized in a consistent manner so that the right information is fed in at the right time so that the right decision maker can act, hopefully proactively, but with an informed process that allows for the safest and secure flight operations as possible.
Thank you, Matt. And we are going to finalize this panel debate. But just before we end it, I'd like each one of you to give few sentences on your key takeaways from our discussion today. Let's start with Guy.
So I think for me, it's the message of more proactive planning using the best information you have. The more you can do before something goes bang, then the better your operation will be and more secure it will be. And I think also challenge your own assumptions. Don't always assume that the information you're seeing from your regulator or from open source is accurate. Make sure that you are actively stress testing it. I think those would be my key takeaways.
Yeah, thank you. Megan?
I feel like it's more of a case of balancing the objective and subjective. Again, like Guy said, challenging assumptions and challenging what's presented in front of you, but then equal collaboration and communication amongst the stakeholders in order to arrive at a decision. So it's the data that you're reviewing, the information you're reviewing, but also I think communication in your team and with your client and regulators, however many people you can communicate together to kind of manage the complex situations that we're all faced with now. Because I think it's not binary, it's not easy, and it moves quickly. So helping one another kind of aggregate that information that we try and aggregate offline independently as organizations, doing that together will help accelerate that process too.
Thank you. Matt?
So I think the biggest takeaway is the only thing that's certain is uncertainty at this point, but that doesn't mean that we can't move forward. Instead of finding one data source to trust, you need to set up the process in the right way, trust the process, trust the expertise, and trust that you're approaching your access to data in a comprehensive and consistent manner so that the information that is put into that process you trust with people you trust comes out the right side of this risk management approach with sound intelligence-led decisions, because we're all looking for that golden BB of information that probably doesn't exist. And even if it does, it might work one time, but it is not repeatable. So do I have a repeatable process with the right expertise and the right approach to accessing data to get genuine risk mitigation results on the other side that not only reduces my risk to escalation, but allows me to seize the opportunity of de-escalation as a business?
Thank you, Matt. And I also have a key takeaway from this. I think we also all need a common process, like agreed indicators for deciding when something is about to de-escalate. We need a shared language across all stakeholders. So there is much more that can be done, though there's a lot of positive progress on this topic. Thank you so much for this very, very interesting discussion. And I'm looking forward for our future collaboration with all of you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.